If you lived in medieval times, there is one feeling you would know very well. Not hunger, not fear, cold. Not dramatic snowstorm cold, just a quiet, constant, never-ending cold that followed you everywhere, like a very rude ghost. For most medieval people, being cold was not a problem to solve. It was just how life felt. Homes were not warm places. Even in summer, stone walls stayed cool and damp. In winter, those same walls felt like they were gently sucking heat out of your bones. Most houses had no insulation at all. If your home was made of stone, it held the cold. If it was made of wood and mud, the wind politely asked permission and then came inside anyway. Fireplaces existed, yes, but they were not magical heat machines. They were open hearths, usually in the middle of the room, and most of the heat went straight up into the air and out through a hole in the roof. The room filled with smoke, your eyes burned, your clothes smelled like fire forever, and you were still cold. People did not heat their homes, they heated themselves. Layers were everything. Medieval people wore multiple layers of wool, linen, and whatever else they could find. Wool was itchy, heavy, and smelled strange when wet, which was often. But wool stayed warm even when damp, so people accepted it the way we accept bad Wi-Fi. If you were poor, you wore the same clothes day and night. You did not change into sleepwear. You slept in what you wore during the day. Sometimes you added another layer. Sometimes you did not have one. That was just unlucky. Beds were not soft or warm. Many people slept on sacks filled with straw or dried grass. Straw pokes, it makes noise, it shifts around, and it does not care about your comfort. Over time, it flattened and turned dusty. You slept anyway because you were tired. Blankets were heavy and scratchy. If you were lucky, they were wool. If you were very lucky, you had more than one. But even with blankets, cold air crept in from every direction. Under the door, through the walls, from the floor. Floors were stone or packed dirt. Cold rose straight up from them. People sometimes laid down reeds or rushes, but those did not last long. They got dirty, they got wet, they got cold. So people shared beds. This was normal. Husbands, wives, children, grandparents, sometimes even visitors, all in one bed or on the same sleeping space. Body heat mattered more than privacy. Privacy was a luxury. Warmth was survival. And sometimes animals slept inside too. Chickens, dogs, cats, and even pigs were brought indoors during winter nights, not because people loved animals in a modern way, but because animals were warm. A pig is basically a walking heater with opinions. If it helped keep the room warmer, it stayed. Winter was long, very long. Without central heating, winter shaped everything. People woke up cold, worked cold, ate cold food unless it was fresh from the fire, went to bed cold. Their hands cracked, their joints hurt, their breath fogged the air indoors. Cold slowed life down. Movements were slower, tasks took longer, fingers went numb. Mistakes happened more often. People accepted this pace. There was no rush because rushing did not make you warmer. Even churches were cold, stone buildings with high ceilings and little light. People stood or knelt for long services while their feet slowly forgot they existed. Faith was strong, toes were not. And yet no one wrote complaints about the cold the way we do now, not because it was not bad, but because it was normal. Doctors believed cold air could cause illness. Cold was blamed for aches, fevers, and bad moods, but there was no real solution beyond stay near the fire and wear more wool. These were not exciting medical discoveries. At night, people used bed curtains if they had them. Heavy fabric hung around the bed to trap warm air. This helped a little. It also trapped smells. Everything smelled back then. You stopped noticing. Sometimes people slept sitting up or curled tightly to keep warm. Sometimes they woke in the night just to move closer to another person. This was not romantic. This was practical. Firewood was expensive. You did not keep the fire burning all night unless you were wealthy. Most fires were allowed to die down before sleep. Morning meant waking up in a room that felt exactly like the outside. Lighting the fire again took time. Fingers stiff with cold tried to spark warmth back into existence. Smoke filled the room. Someone coughed. Another person complained quietly. Life continued. Cold also changed how people thought about comfort. Comfort was not expected. It was noticed when it appeared, like a surprise guest. A warm day in winter felt almost magical. A dry cloak mattered more than fashion. A sunny wall to lean against was worth standing still for. People learned to read the weather closely. Wind direction mattered. Clouds mattered. The smell of the air mattered. You prepared, not to stay warm, but to stay less cold. And humor existed, even here. Medieval jokes sometimes mentioned frozen feet or stiff fingers. Cold was shared suffering, and shared suffering creates jokes. Quiet ones, simple ones, the kind you tell while rubbing your hands together. If you think about it, medieval life was not cold in sudden bursts. It was cold in a steady, patient way, like the world itself was saying, yes, this is how it is. And people adapted. They worked around daylight. They rested more in winter. They ate heavier food when they could. They gathered close. They waited. Cold shaped their days, their nights, their homes, and their habits. It was not an enemy to fight. It was a condition of being alive. So when you imagine medieval times, don't picture roaring fires and cozy halls. Picture quiet rooms, stone walls, wool sleeves pulled down over tired hands, breath hanging softly in the air. Just people, being cold, together, and somehow sleeping anyway. If you could travel back to medieval times, the first thing you would notice would not be the castles, not the clothes, not even the people. It would be the smell, and it would notice you too. The medieval world smelled alive, very alive, loudly alive. Every street, every room, every person carried layers of scent that mixed together into something modern noses are not prepared for. There was no escape from it. Smell was part of the air itself. Cities had no real sewage systems. Waste went somewhere, but that somewhere was usually outside, down the street, or into a nearby ditch. People used chamber pots at night and emptied them in the morning, sometimes carefully, sometimes not, sometimes from a window, which made walking a small adventure. Streets were busy places. People walked, animals stopped walking and did other things. Horses, donkeys, cows, pigs, dogs, and chickens all shared the same narrow roads as people. Animal waste stayed where it landed until rain or feet moved it somewhere else. Rain helped, but it also made things worse. Wet dirt smells stronger. Wet waste smells stronger. Mud held on to every scent and politely spread it around. Then there were the trades. Tanners worked with animal skins, soaking them in urine and other substances to soften the leather. Tanneries smelled so bad they were often pushed to the edge of town, where the wind could carry the problem elsewhere. It still came back. Butchers worked openly. Blood ran into the streets. Fishmongers sold fish that was not always fresh. Bakers filled the air with warm bread smells, which helped, but only briefly. One good smell does not cancel 10 bad ones. It just confuses them. Homes were not fresh places either. Smoke from the hearth filled rooms daily. Walls absorbed it, clothes absorbed it, hair absorbed it. Everything smelled like fire, damp wool, and people who had been wearing the same clothes for a very long time. Bathing was rare for many, and soap was basic. Washing often meant rinsing with cold water, which was unpleasant in winter and not especially effective. Cleanliness meant less dirty, not fresh. And yet, medieval people did not walk around thinking, wow, this smells terrible. This was normal. The human brain is very good at adjusting. When you live inside a smell long enough, it fades into the background. People noticed changes in smell more than constant ones. A new bad smell meant something was wrong. A familiar bad smell meant everything was fine. Perfume existed, but not like today. It was strong and heavy, made from herbs, flowers, and resins. People carried scented pouches or wore herbs to cover unpleasant odors, not to remove them, just to argue with them. Churches smelled too. Incense helped, but churches were full of people standing close together for long periods. Add damp stone, candles, and unwashed clothing, and you had a very specific church smell. People associated it with holiness, not discomfort. Illness had a smell. Doctors sometimes diagnosed sickness by scent, bad breath, sweet breath, rotten smells from wounds. The body gave signals, and smell was one of them. It was not polite, but it was useful. Death smelled. Bodies were often kept at home before burial. In warm weather, this became urgent. Herbs were used again, not to stop decay, but to slow it and soften it. Death was close enough that people learned its smell early in life. Children grew up surrounded by it. They did not wrinkle their noses the way we do. Their sense of normal formed inside this world. What shocks us would have felt ordinary to them. Even nature smelled different. Forests were thick and dark. Animals lived everywhere. Smoke from constant fires hung low over towns. Rivers carried waste downstream. Clean water smelled precious. Smell also carried information. You could smell rain coming. You could smell a fire before you saw it. You could smell a stranger, especially if they came from far away. Travel left traces. New places announced themselves through the nose. This made people more aware of their surroundings. Smell was a warning system, a comfort, a habit, and sometimes a joke. Medieval humor included jokes about bad smells, especially about certain jobs or places. Everyone knew which streets to avoid. Everyone knew which neighbors smelled worse than others. These were quiet jokes shared with a shrug. You did not complain loudly. Complaining did not clean the street. At night, smells settled. Fires died down, the air grew still. Cold, trapped odors close to the ground. Rooms felt heavy. People slept anyway. Sleep came easier when you were exhausted and used to discomfort. Over time, smells became memories. The smell of bread meant safety. The smell of smoke meant home. The smell of animals meant warmth and work. Even unpleasant smells marked familiarity. A town had its own scent, like a signature. Leaving it meant noticing the absence of it. Arriving somewhere new meant learning its smell slowly, day by day. Modern life has trained us to expect neutral air. Medieval life did not offer that option. Air was full. It told stories. It reminded people where they were and what kind of day it was. So when you imagine medieval streets, do not imagine silence and stone alone. Imagine air that feels thick, busy, crowded with information, a world where your nose works as hard as your eyes. And after a while, you stop noticing it, because humans are very good at adapting, even to things that smell terrible, especially when there's no choice. When medieval people went to sleep, they did not think of it as one long, smooth experience. Sleep was not a single event. It was more like a loose arrangement. First, there was darkness. Real darkness. Not the soft, polite darkness we have now, filled with tiny lights and glowing screens. Medieval darkness was complete. When the sun went down, the world quietly disappeared. Candles existed, but they were expensive. Most people saved them for important moments. Firelight helped, but fires burned low at night to save fuel. Eventually, the room became dim, then shadowy, then almost invisible. So people went to bed early, not because they were tired, but because there was nothing else to do. You could not scroll. You could not read unless you were wealthy and had light. You could sit and think, but thinking gets boring when you are cold. Beds were simple, sometimes just a wooden frame, sometimes just the floor. Straw mattresses shifted and poked. Rope beds sagged and needed tightening. Sharing was common, very common. Families slept together. Servants slept near their masters. Inns placed strangers side by side with little concern. Privacy was rare, and silence even rarer. Someone always snored. Someone always moved. Someone always whispered a prayer. Then came the first sleep. People fell asleep for a few hours, deep and heavy. This was the most restful part of the night. The body sank into warmth, as much as it could. The mind drifted. And then, very naturally, people woke up. Not suddenly, not in panic, just awake. This was normal. The space between sleeps lasted an hour or two. People prayed, they talked quietly, they checked on animals. Some even did small tasks. Midwives expected births at this time. Thieves liked this hour too. It was calm and quiet. Couples talked. Sometimes they argued. Sometimes they did nothing at all. The house existed in a strange half state, awake but not busy. Then came the second sleep. This one was lighter. More dreams, more movement. Morning crept closer. Roosters made mistakes about the time and tried again later. Someone coughed, someone rolled over. Dreams mattered. People believed dreams carried meaning. Good dreams were messages. Bad dreams were warnings. Nightmares were taken seriously. Sleep paralysis, though not named, was feared. People thought demons sat on chests. This made sense if you woke unable to move in a dark room that already smelled strange. Sleep positions were practical. People curled up to stay warm. Some slept sitting up, especially the sick. Pillows were rare. Comfort was limited. You learned to sleep anyway. Noise never fully stopped. Animals moved, wind pushed through cracks, wood creaked. In towns, drunk voices drifted in late. In villages, wolves howled far away. You learned which sounds mattered and which did not. People did not expect perfect rest. Sleep was something you did when you could. Being tired was normal. Complaining about bad sleep would have sounded strange. Night was also dangerous. Fires spread easily in darkness. Thieves moved quietly. People feared spirits, demons, and wandering souls. Candles were sometimes left burning, which was risky but comforting. Church bells marked time, even at night. Bells reminded people that the world was still turning, that God was still watching, that morning would arrive eventually. When morning came, it did not arrive gently. People woke cold. Fires had died. The rooms smelled stale. Bodies were stiff. Sleep ended not because you felt ready, but because the day demanded it. Children woke with everyone else. There was no sleeping in. Work began early. Animals needed care. Food needed preparing. Light was precious and limited. Sleep was not protected time. It was flexible, interrupted, shared. And yet, people adapted. They rested when they could. They napped during the day. They accepted tiredness as part of life. Sleep did not need to be perfect to be useful. Medieval sleep advice would not survive one medieval night, but medieval people survived many. They learned their bodies. They learned the night. They learned to rest in pieces. So when you imagine medieval sleep, do not picture a quiet room and a single dreamless stretch. Picture a long night, broken gently in two, a house breathing, people waking, whispering, praying, then sleeping again. Not because something was wrong, but because that was how humans slept when the night was truly dark. When people hear that medieval folks did not bathe very often, they usually imagine everyone walking around completely filthy, happily ignoring water like it personally offended them. That is not quite true. Medieval people liked being clean. They just had a very different relationship with water, effort, and consequences. Bathing was not simple. You could not just turn a handle and wait for the water to warm up. First, someone had to fetch the water. Buckets were heavy, wells were far, rivers were cold. Then the water had to be heated over a fire, which took time, fuel, and patience. Firewood was not free. Neither was labor. So bathing was an event. For many people, washing meant cleaning parts of the body, not the whole thing. Hands, face, and feet were washed regularly. These were practical areas. They touched food, work tools, and the ground. A full body bath was saved for special occasions. Before large plagues, public bathhouses existed in many towns. People went together. It was social. It was warm. It was actually enjoyable. You talked, relaxed, and soaked. For a while, medieval bathing culture was doing just fine. Then fear arrived. As plagues spread, people noticed something disturbing. Those who bathed often sometimes got sick afterward. The belief formed that hot water opened the pores and allowed illness to enter the body. This made sense at the time. If you bathed and then died a few days later, the bath looked suspicious. Doctors began advising against frequent bathing. Clean skin was no longer seen as protective. It was seen as vulnerable. So people adjusted. Instead of bathing, they focused on clean clothes. Linen undergarments were changed and washed more often than outer clothing. The idea was that the linen absorbed sweat and dirt, protecting the body underneath. This was considered good hygiene. People also used perfumes, oils, and herbs, not just to smell nice, but to protect themselves. Strong scents were believed to block bad air. A nose full of rosemary felt safer than an empty one. Cold weather played a role too. Bathing in winter was dangerous. Wet skin plus cold air could lead to illness. This was not superstition. Hypothermia existed, even if the word did not. Water itself was not always clean. Rivers carried waste. Wells could be contaminated. Bathing in dirty water did not help much. Sometimes it made things worse. Skin infections were common, so people made choices based on risk. Bathing was not avoided because people didn't care. It was avoided because it was complicated, risky, and expensive. And also uncomfortable. Cold water was cold, very cold. No one enjoyed it unless it was very hot outside, and even then it was brief. Hot baths required effort and fuel. The pleasure had to be worth the work. For the wealthy, things were different. They bathed more often. They had servants to heat water and carry it. They had private tubs, but even they followed medical advice and limited bathing at times. Monks had strict rules about bathing. Too much bathing was seen as indulgent. Comfort could lead to temptation. A little dirt kept the soul focused. This idea spread quietly into everyday life. Cleanliness was moral, but not physical in the way we think of it. People associated cleanliness with order, modesty, and behavior. A clean conscience mattered more than clean skin. You could be a good person and still smell strange. And smell, again, was normal. Everyone smelled. The goal was not to be odorless. The goal was not to smell worse than everyone else. Washing days happened. Clothes were scrubbed. Bodies were wiped. Hair was combed carefully. Lice were picked out by hand. This was intimate and unpleasant, but normal. People checked each other. Families helped. There was no embarrassment in it. Survival was more important than pride. Soap existed, but it was harsh. It burned the skin. It stripped oils. Frequent use caused irritation. People noticed this and avoided it unless needed. Bathing also required privacy, which was rare. Removing clothes meant vulnerability. Not everyone wanted that, especially women who faced social judgment more quickly. So bathing happened quietly, carefully, and not very often. When people did bathe, it could be joyful. Warm water relaxed sore muscles. It felt like luxury. Children played. Adults sighed. For a moment, life felt softer. Then the water cooled. Someone had to dump it out. The fire needed attention. Reality returned. Modern life tells us cleanliness is constant and effortless. Medieval life taught that cleanliness was situational, practical, negotiated. They were not ignorant. They were cautious. They balanced warmth, health, effort, and belief. They did what made sense to them based on what they knew and what they could afford. So when you imagine medieval people avoiding baths, don't imagine stubbornness. Imagine calculation. Is it warm enough? Is the water clean enough? Is the firewood worth it? Will this make me sick? Sometimes the answer was yes. Often it was no. And life continued, slightly dusty, slightly scented, and very human. It might sound strange, but medieval people often worked fewer days in a year than many people do now. Not because life was easier, not because they were relaxed, but because work followed a very different rhythm. Time did not belong to clocks. It belonged to daylight, seasons, and the church. For peasants, work was intense but uneven. When work needed to be done, it was done hard and fast. When it did not, people waited. Winter slowed everything. Fields rested. Tools rested. People rested as much as cold allowed. The church calendar ruled the year. There were feast days, many feast days. Saints had days. Events had days. Religious holidays filled the calendar like quiet pauses. On these days, work stopped or slowed. Not always happily, but firmly. These were not optional breaks. Refusing to observe a holy day could bring trouble. Rest was part of obedience. Doing nothing could be the correct behavior. Sundays were protected. No field work, no heavy labor. People gathered, stood, prayed, listened, and stood some more. It was not exactly relaxing, but it was not plowing either. There were also seasonal limits. You could not farm when the ground was frozen. You could not harvest before crops grew. Nature decided the schedule, not ambition. Work itself was physical and demanding. Plowing with animals took strength. Harvesting took endurance. Carrying water, chopping wood, grinding grain, all of it wore the body down. When work stopped, it stopped because bodies needed it to. Medieval people did not work 9 hours a day, 5 days a week. That idea would have sounded very specific and very confusing. They worked when there was light. They stopped when there was not. This did not mean leisure in the modern sense. Rest meant mending tools, fixing clothes, telling stories, or sitting quietly. It meant not using every muscle at once. Children worked too, light tasks at first, watching animals, gathering fuel, helping where they could. Childhood was not protected, but it was paced. Guild workers in towns had different rhythms. They followed rules. They had limits on hours and output. Overworking could get you fined. Producing too much was seen as unfair. Balance mattered more than speed. There was also communal pressure. If everyone stopped for a feast day and you did not, people noticed. Work was social. Rest was social too. Of course, hunger changed things. Bad harvests forced longer hours. Survival did not respect holidays. But even then, work followed necessity, not habit. People understood exhaustion differently. Being tired was expected. Being endlessly tired was not. You rested when you could, because tomorrow might demand more. Time passed slowly. Without clocks, days blended together. Weeks were felt, not measured. Waiting was common. You waited for weather. You waited for growth. You waited for news. Modern life treats waiting as wasted time. Medieval life treated it as normal time. Even the wealthy paused. Courts followed seasons. Travel slowed in winter. Business waited for roads to clear. Letters took weeks. Urgency was rare. This does not mean medieval life was easy or pleasant. Bodies wore out early. Injuries lasted. Pain lingered. But the pressure to always be productive did not exist in the same way. Work had an end point each day: darkness. When the sun went down, most work stopped. There was no artificial extension, no late-night deadlines. The night belonged to rest, prayer, and sleep. In a strange way, this gave life a gentler shape. Hard days existed, very hard days, but they were followed by pauses built into the calendar, the seasons, and the sky itself. People complained, of course, about lords, about taxes, about weather, but they did not complain about being busy all the time. Busyness was not a virtue. So when you imagine medieval labor, do not imagine endless grinding days. Imagine intense effort followed by forced stillness. Imagine work shaped by light and faith, not by minutes and screens. A slower year, a heavier day, and a kind of rest that came whether you wanted it or not. Medieval life was full of people. Houses were shared. Beds were shared. Streets were narrow. Villages were small. You were almost never physically alone. And yet, loneliness existed everywhere. It was a quiet kind of loneliness, the kind that does not come from empty rooms, but from feeling unseen inside a crowd. Most people did not choose their lives. Marriages were arranged. Work was inherited. Homes were fixed. You were born into a role and expected to stay there. Wanting something else was dangerous and usually pointless. Husbands and wives lived close, but emotional closeness was not guaranteed. Marriage was practical. Love might grow, but it was not required. Duty mattered more than comfort. Many couples worked side by side without ever really knowing each other. Children grew up fast. Emotional attention was limited. High child mortality made attachment risky. Loving deeply meant risking deep pain, so affection was often quiet, controlled, and restrained. Widows and widowers felt loneliness sharply. Death came often and without warning. When a partner died, life moved on quickly. Remarriage was common. Grief had to fit into daily work. There was little space for long mourning. Travelers experienced another kind of loneliness. Roads were dangerous. Inns were loud and crowded. You were surrounded by strangers who would forget you the next day. Stories were shared, then vanished. Monks and nuns chose solitude, but even that was structured. Silence followed rules. Isolation had purpose. But behind stone walls, many still felt the weight of separation from family and the outside world. Hermits lived at the edges of society. Some sought holiness, some fled disappointment. People respected them, but did not truly know them. Loneliness became a form of identity. Letters were rare. News traveled slowly. If someone left, they might never return. You did not always know what happened to people you loved. They simply became part of the past. Friendship existed, but it was shaped by work and survival. You bonded over shared tasks, over shared hunger, over shared cold. Conversations were practical. Feelings were not often discussed. Religion offered comfort, but also distance. People confessed privately, but lived publicly. Inner thoughts belonged to God, not to friends. This kept some feelings safely contained, but also isolated. There were moments of connection, festivals, music, laughter, shared meals. These moments mattered deeply because they were rare. Joy stood out against routine. But between those moments, life was repetitive. Days blurred. People carried thoughts they never voiced, dreams they never chased, losses they never fully explained. Mental health was not a concept. Sadness was seen as spiritual weakness or fate. People endured rather than explored. Silence was strength. Even in families, solitude existed. Crowded homes did not mean shared understanding. Everyone carried private fears, illness, guilt, doubt. These stayed inside. At night, when the house finally grew quiet, loneliness surfaced. In the dark, with nothing to do and nowhere to go, thoughts became loud. Sleep helped. Prayer helped. Mourning helped. People survived by focusing outward, on tasks, on rules, on routines. Looking inward for too long was risky. So medieval loneliness was not dramatic. It did not cry out. It settled in quietly, like dust. And still, people endured. They told stories. They sang. They joked. They leaned on habits. They found meaning where they could. They were not unaware of loneliness. They just didn't expect it to be solved. Sometimes, simply being part of the same world was enough. In medieval times, animals were not something you visited. They were something you lived with, everywhere. If you walked through a medieval town or village, animals filled the space the way cars do now. You stepped around them, you listened for them, you accepted their presence as normal. Horses moved goods and people. Oxen pulled plows slowly and patiently. Donkeys carried loads they did not complain about. Cows wandered, ate, and provided milk when conditions allowed. Pigs roamed freely, cleaning up waste with great enthusiasm. Dogs guarded homes, helped hunt, and ate scraps. Cats controlled mice and were sometimes respected, sometimes feared. Chickens wandered wherever they pleased, producing eggs when they felt like it. Animals lived close because survival demanded it. Bringing animals inside during winter was common. Not all animals, but many. Warmth mattered more than smell or noise. A cow in a lower room warmed the space above it. Chickens stayed safe from predators. Dogs slept near people. Homes were not designed to separate humans from animals. They were designed to shelter both. Children grew up surrounded by animals. They learned early how to care for them. They also learned early how animals died. Birth and death happened in full view. There was little mystery. Emotional bonds formed, but they were complicated. Animals were useful. They were valuable. They were also food. Loving an animal did not stop you from eating it when needed. People talked to animals, gave them names, complained about them, trusted them. Animals were co-workers. Some animals even faced the law. Yes, medieval courts sometimes put animals on trial. Pigs were accused of attacking children. Rats were summoned to court for destroying crops. These trials were symbolic, but they show how animals were seen as part of moral order, not outside it. Animals also carried danger. Bites caused infections, kicks killed, diseases passed between species. Living close increased risk, but distance was not an option. Markets were loud with animals. Slaughter happened openly. Blood, noise, and movement filled the streets. Children watched. Adults worked. No one pretended food came from nowhere. Religion included animals too. Saints protected livestock. Blessings were given for fields and herds. Losing animals meant losing security. At night, animal sounds filled the dark. Hooves shifted, dogs barked, cows breathed heavily. These sounds were comforting. Silence was suspicious. Even the wealthy lived with animals. Horses filled stables near living quarters. Falcons sat on perches. Hunting dogs slept close. Animals were symbols of status and tools of survival. Animals shaped daily schedules. Feeding times mattered, weather mattered, health mattered. You planned your day around their needs. Modern life hides animals away. Medieval life did the opposite. It placed them at the center. People understood animals deeply, not in a romantic way, but in a practical one. They read body language, they sensed illness, they noticed mood changes. Animals were not background noise, they were active participants in daily life. So when you imagine medieval streets, imagine movement, noise, warm bodies, mud, fur, feathers. A world where humans were not separate from nature, they lived inside it. Childhood in medieval times did not stretch gently across many years. It moved quickly, sometimes too quickly. From the moment a child could walk, they were slowly pulled into the adult world. Not pushed harshly most of the time, just guided, expected, and needed. Babies were loved, but carefully. Infant mortality was high, very high. Many children did not survive their first years. Parents learned, often painfully, not to assume too much. Love existed, but it was guarded. You could not protect yourself completely from grief, but you could stand a little further back from it. Swaddling was common. Babies were wrapped tightly in cloth, limiting movement. This kept them warm and calm. It also made them easier to manage while adults worked. Crying babies were comforted, but they could not always be carried around. Work did not stop. Once children grew stronger, expectations followed. By the age of 5 or 6, many children helped with small tasks, watching animals, carrying water, gathering sticks, running messages. These jobs were not seen as unfair. They were simply part of learning how to live. Play existed, but it blended into work. Games used sticks, stones, and imagination. Children played where adults worked. There were no special spaces set aside for childhood. Education was rare for most. Learning happened by watching and copying. Skills passed from parent to child naturally. A farmer's child learned farming. A baker's child learned dough. A blacksmith's child learned fire. Mistakes were corrected quickly, sometimes kindly, sometimes not. Patience was limited. Survival left little room for repeated errors. Children were dressed like small adults. There was no special fashion for childhood. Clothing was practical and often reused from older siblings. Growth was inconvenient. Clothes were adjusted, patched, and passed down. Silence was expected. Children were seen, not always heard. Talking too much was discouraged. Asking questions could be risky. Curiosity was useful, but obedience mattered more. Punishment existed. Corporal punishment was normal. It was not always cruel, but it was accepted. Discipline was about shaping behavior quickly, not understanding feelings deeply. And yet this does not mean medieval parents did not care. They worried. They prayed. They protected when they could. They taught what they knew. Love was expressed through preparation, not praise. Lullabies were sung, stories were told, legends and religious tales filled young minds. Fear and comfort came together. Saints protected children. Monsters warned them. Religion shaped childhood strongly. Children learned prayers early. They learned about sin before they fully understood choice. Guilt arrived early too. By the age of 7, many children were considered capable of reason. This was an important line. Responsibility increased, expectations hardened. Teenage years as we know them did not exist. Adolescence blended into adulthood. By 12 or 13, many were working full-time. Some married young, others entered apprenticeships. Childhood ended quietly. Friendships formed, but they were often temporary. Families moved. Children were sent away to work. Loss happened early. Death of siblings was common. Grief was shared, but not lingered on. Games existed, simple ones. Ball games, wrestling, singing, chasing. Laughter happened. Children were not joyless, but joy was woven into life, not separated from it. Illness was a constant threat. A fever could take a child quickly. Medical care was limited. Parents waited, watched, prayed, and hoped. Sometimes hope was enough. Sometimes it was not. When a child died, the household mourned briefly and then returned to work. This was not coldness, it was necessity. Life demanded movement. Children learned this lesson early. The world did not pause. There were moments of tenderness, a parent teaching a skill patiently, a shared meal, a story repeated many times, a small gift. These moments mattered deeply because they were not guaranteed. Medieval childhood was not cruel by design. It was shaped by reality, short lives, hard work, uncertainty. Modern childhood stretches time. Medieval childhood compressed it. Children became capable quickly because they had to. Silence was not oppression, it was survival. And still, children dreamed. They imagined different lives. They listened to travelers. They watched nobles pass. They wondered quietly. Most dreams stayed inside. So when you imagine medieval children, do not imagine joyless faces. Imagine seriousness mixed with laughter, responsibility mixed with curiosity, small hands learning heavy lessons early, a childhood that did not last long, but one that prepared them for the world they were born into. Death was never far away in medieval times. It did not hide in hospitals or quiet rooms. It walked openly through homes, fields, and streets. People saw death often. Children saw it. Adults expected it. Old age was respected because it was rare. Most people did not imagine a long life. They imagined a life that could end suddenly, without warning and without explanation. Illness arrived quickly. A fever, an infection, a cut that went bad. There were no antibiotics. There were no real cures. Doctors tried what they could, but mostly they waited and watched. So did families. The fear was not always death itself. It was dying alone. To die without witnesses was considered terrible. A lonely death meant no prayers, no last words, no proper ending. People wanted someone there, anyone, a hand to hold, a voice to hear. Last rites mattered deeply. Confession cleared the soul. The final blessing prepared the spirit. Missing this was frightening. People feared what came after, and they wanted help crossing into it. So when someone became ill, others gathered. Family members stayed close. Neighbors came. Children were not sent away. Death was not hidden from them. It was part of learning how the world worked. Beds became crowded. People whispered prayers. Candles burned. Time slowed. Everyone waited together. If death came at night, someone stayed awake. Watching mattered. Leaving someone alone felt wrong, almost dangerous. Sudden deaths were the worst. A man crushed in a field, a woman dying in childbirth, a traveler collapsing on the road. These deaths haunted communities. They were discussed quietly, with concern. What if it happened to you? This fear shaped behavior. People traveled in groups when possible. They avoided dangerous paths. They checked on neighbors. Loneliness was risky. Community was safety. When someone did die, the body often stayed in the home. Burial happened quickly, but not instantly. People gathered, they touched the body, they prayed near it. There was no distance. The smell of death was familiar. Herbs were used, but mostly to honor, not to hide. Death was acknowledged, not disguised. Funerals were communal. Even the poor were buried, though sometimes without markers. Graves were reused. Bones rested together. Individual identity faded, but community memory remained. Mass graves existed during plagues and disasters. These were frightening times. When death came too fast, the rituals broke down. This caused panic, not just grief. People remembered who stayed and who did not. Religion helped explain death, but it did not remove sadness. Heaven existed, but separation still hurt. Hell existed too, which made last moments feel urgent. People worried about unfinished business, debts, arguments, promises, words not said. A good death allowed closure. A bad death left questions hanging. So people prepared. Wills were written early. Possessions were simple but important. A pot, a cloak, a tool. These were passed down carefully. People talked about death openly. They planned for it. It was not morbid, it was practical. Even jokes existed, dark ones. Humor helped manage fear. Laughter did not erase death, but it softened it. Children learned early that life was temporary. This did not make them fearless, it made them attentive. At night, people prayed not just to live, but to die well, to have company, to be remembered, to not disappear quietly. The idea of being forgotten was almost as frightening as death itself. Being seen mattered, being named mattered. Modern life fears death by avoiding it. Medieval life feared death by facing it. People did not expect comfort at the end. They expected presence, a hand, a voice, a prayer, and if possible, a familiar face. So when you imagine medieval death, do not imagine silence and distance. Imagine crowded rooms, whispered words, flickering light, waiting, not just for the end, but for someone to stay until it arrived. In medieval times, food was not about taste, fancy ingredients, or culinary adventure. It was about survival, and that meant it was often repetitive, plain, and, well, boring. Bread was the mainstay. Almost everyone ate it at nearly every meal. White bread was for the wealthy. Dark, coarse bread was for peasants. It was filling. It was reliable. It was not exciting, but it kept people alive. Meals were dictated by what could be grown locally. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye dominated. Vegetables like cabbage, onions, and beans appeared when possible. Fruit was seasonal. Meat was rare for most. Hunting was limited. Livestock was valuable for milk, wool, and labor. Eating it meant losing more than just dinner. Spices existed, but they were expensive. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were more precious than gold for the average person. When they appeared in food, it was special. For most meals, seasoning was minimal. Salt helped preserve and flavor food, but that was about it. Soup and pottage were common. These were thick stews made of grains, vegetables, and sometimes bits of meat or fish. You ate what was available. You ate what grew. You ate what survived. Repetition was part of life. You did not think much about variety. Seasonal hunger existed. Winter was particularly hard. Stored food ran out. Fields lay bare. People survived on minimal calories. Meals were small and sometimes barely filling. Even the wealthy ate repetitively. Meat, cheese, bread, and ale formed much of their diet. Fancy sauces and pies existed, but variety was still limited by preservation and transportation. Food preparation required time and effort. Grinding grain was laborious. Cooking over an open fire took hours. Fires were smoky. Utensils were basic. Mess was unavoidable. Efficiency mattered more than flavor. Preservation mattered. Smoke, salt, and vinegar helped keep food edible. Freshness lasted briefly. Rotten food could kill. Caution shaped menus. Meals were social. Eating alone was rare. Families, households, and workers gathered to share what little or much they had. Conversation was limited by practicality. Work often followed food. Food followed work. Eating was necessary. Enjoyment was optional. People appreciated food quietly. They noticed warmth, fullness, and sustenance. Flavor was secondary. Food also reflected hierarchy. Peasants ate what they could grow. Artisans might enjoy more variety. Nobles could afford spices, exotic meats, and sugar, but even luxury had rules. Preservation and seasonality limited choice. Children ate smaller portions. Their diets mirrored adults. They learned early that food was functional. Treats existed sometimes, dried fruit, honey, or small cakes, but rarely. Drinks were basic. Water could be unsafe. Ale and beer were common because fermentation killed germs. Wine existed for the wealthy. Milk was mostly for children. Tea and coffee had not arrived yet. Cooking tools were simple. Pots, cauldrons, spits, and hearths did the work. Fires required constant attention. Someone always watched the food. Someone always stirred. Someone always worried it might burn. Eating habits were influenced by superstition and belief. Certain foods were thought to affect health, mood, or spiritual state. Overeating was discouraged. Fasting was common during religious periods. The body was a temple, but a hungry one. Even in scarcity, humor existed. People joked about bland pottage or overcooked bread. Complaints were shared quietly, often in communal settings where shared misery was tolerable. Meals were not about choice. They were about rhythm. Harvest dictated what you ate. Weather dictated how often. Illness dictated when you could eat at all. People survived on repetition. Hunger shaped imagination. The body adapted. Taste adapted. Expectations were modest. So when you imagine medieval food, don't picture feasts in movies. Picture quiet kitchens, smoke rising from a hearth, children eating bread, adults stirring pots, everyone waiting for the next meal, grateful it existed. And somehow, life continued. If you were sick in medieval times, you had few options. Medicine existed, yes, but it was slow, strange, and mostly about observation rather than action. Most of all, it was about waiting. People could not call a doctor on a whim, check WebMD, or even pop a pill and hope for relief. Instead, they learned that illness was part of life, and survival required patience, care, and a bit of luck. Doctors had limited tools. Herbs, poultices, and bloodletting were common. Sometimes these worked, sometimes they did not. Sometimes they made things worse. People understood that medicine was imperfect, but they hoped for miracles in the middle of hardship. Even with these limitations, medieval people often developed surprisingly effective home remedies passed down from generation to generation. Folk wisdom mattered as much as formal training, and sometimes more, because doctors were expensive or far away. Bloodletting was one of the most popular treatments. A barber, surgeon, or sometimes just a barber, would open a vein, letting blood flow. The belief was that too much blood caused disease and that removing it could restore balance. Sometimes it worked, if only because certain fevers naturally subsided. Sometimes it weakened patients further, but it was a ritual people trusted. Waiting, meanwhile, was the real medicine. The patient lay in bed while others did the work, and survival depended on whether the body could heal itself faster than the illness could progress. Herbs were everywhere. Chamomile, sage, and garlic were used for digestive problems. Lavender helped with sleep. Willow bark, which we now know contains aspirin, helped pain. Even mundane plants like nettles or dandelion leaves were valued for treating fevers, rashes, or digestive issues. Recipes varied by town, family, and sometimes rumor. A single herb might have 10 different uses depending on who was giving advice. Knowledge was oral, practical, and sometimes inconsistent, but it gave people hope. Prayer mattered too. Faith and healing were intertwined. People prayed for relief. Holy water, charms, blessings, and pilgrimages were considered valid parts of treatment. Spiritual health was as important as physical health. If the soul was safe, perhaps the body would follow. People often trusted divine intervention more than any doctor, because while medicine was uncertain, God's help felt reliable, even if invisible. Surgery existed but was rare and brutal. Amputations, trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, and cauterization were performed by skilled hands. Anesthesia was minimal or non-existent, so pain was unavoidable. Survival, not comfort, was the goal. Patients had to endure severe pain with stoicism. Even simple operations carried massive risk. Infection could kill. Waiting again became part of the process because after surgery, the body had to heal on its own. People rested. Rest was medicine. Warmth, calm, and quiet allowed the body to fight illness naturally. Patients stayed in bed, often surrounded by family or neighbors. Caregivers brought food, water, and comfort. Sometimes the mere presence of another human made a huge difference. Recovery depended more on time than intervention. There was no shortcut, no miracle pill, just slow healing, patience, and luck. Doctors often watched more than acted. Observation was key. Pulse, urine, color, and behavior were studied. Remedies were offered cautiously. Sometimes the advice was simple: eat, rest, and hope, and waiting remained central. Patience was built into every step of medieval medicine because you could not make the body heal faster. You could only survive until it did. Illness was expected. Children often experienced fevers. Adults endured injuries. Epidemics swept towns. Waiting became normal. You could not speed up recovery, only endure it. Everyone in the household learned that sickness could last for days, weeks, or even months. Normal life continued around the sick, but everyone adjusted their expectations. There was no instant cure, no doctor on call, just time. Homes were full of remedies: vinegar for cleaning wounds, honey for infections, onions for coughs, smoke for purification. The smells of medicine mingled with the smells of everyday life: smoke, cooking, and sometimes unwashed bodies. Everyone learned to recognize these scents. Certain odors indicated illness, others promised relief. People paid attention to what worked and what did not. Observation became part of survival. Medical knowledge was uneven. Some healers were highly skilled, others were charlatans. People had to learn whom to trust carefully. The stakes were high. Choosing the wrong person could mean worsening illness or even death. Families often relied on multiple sources of knowledge: herbal remedies from grandmothers, prayers from priests, and occasional visits from licensed physicians if affordable. Mental health was not a concept. Anxiety, grief, depression, and trauma were considered spiritual or moral issues. People endured quietly, finding comfort in routines, prayer, and community. Waiting and endurance were not just for physical illness, they applied to emotional struggles as well. Everyone had to be resilient because support systems were limited and expectations high. Hospitals existed, but they were rare. Monasteries sometimes provided care. Poorhouses occasionally offered food and shelter for the sick. Most people relied on family and neighbors. Community care mattered. People shared responsibilities. Someone fetched water, another stoked the fire, and another stayed awake to watch the patient. Healing was not an individual task, it was a household effort. Even medicine had humor. Remedies sometimes involved bizarre advice: eating earth to absorb toxins, wearing charms for protection, or reciting peculiar prayers. The absurdity was tolerated because hope mattered more than logic. People often laughed quietly at strange prescriptions while still using them diligently. Humor was survival. Patience became a skill. Waiting for a fever to break, waiting for wounds to heal, waiting for plague to pass. Life trained people to endure discomfort, uncertainty, and delay. Waiting was medicine, resilience was treatment, and hope was the invisible force that kept people alive. Infections were deadly. A simple cut could become fatal. Antibiotics did not exist. Survival depended on luck, timing, and care. Families prepared for loss while simultaneously hoping for recovery. They learned to accept uncertainty and make peace with it. So when you imagine medieval medicine, don't picture bustling clinics with advanced technology. Picture quiet rooms, candles flickering, a healer whispering advice, a patient resting, breathing, waiting. The body, the spirit, and time were all part of treatment. Waiting was as important as herbs, prayer as important as bloodletting. Life continued, slowly, quietly, often unpredictably. And somehow, people survived. Again and again. Medieval nights were very different from ours. There were no streetlights, no neon signs, no buzzing cities alive 24/7. Night was truly dark, truly quiet, and sometimes truly frightening. The first thing you notice about medieval night is how early it came. The sun set and light disappeared quickly. Candles and hearth fires provided some illumination, but it was limited. Shadows stretched, flickered, and merged. What you could see during the day vanished. The world became a place where imagination could run wild, and usually did. People did not go out much after dark. Streets were dangerous. Thieves prowled. Wolves sometimes wandered near villages. Travelers could be attacked or lost. Darkness amplified fear. One step in the wrong place might mean falling into a ditch, stepping in waste, or worse. People quickly learned to respect the night. Noise never stopped completely. Dogs barked, animals stirred, owls hooted. The wind crept through cracks in buildings, making strange sounds. Doors creaked, roofs groaned under the weight of thatch and snow. People knew which noises were harmless and which might signal danger. Experience turned fear into awareness, but it did not eliminate the feeling entirely. Nightlife existed, though, in its own medieval way. Taverns were active, alehouses filled with locals after work, talking, laughing, singing, and sometimes fighting. Music was simple but lively. Drums, flutes, lutes. Stories were told, rumors spread, gossip traveled faster than the wind. These gatherings were warm, social, and a little rowdy. Religious events shaped night activity too. Candlelit processions, vigils, and prayers were common. Church bells rang at night, reminding people of the passage of time and the presence of the divine. Festivals and holy days sometimes brought people into the streets at night, filling the darkness with light, laughter, and ritual. Sleep was not always continuous. People often experienced first sleep and second sleep, a pattern of resting, waking, and then resting again. The hours in between were quiet but active, reading, praying, talking, or checking on animals. Nighttime chores happened too, feeding animals, tending fires, or repairing tools for the next day. Darkness was practical, not just frightening. Fear was real, though. Night was associated with the supernatural. Spirits, demons, and ghosts were believed to move freely in darkness. People told stories to explain noises, misfortune, or sudden illness. Nightmares were feared as messages, not just dreams. Sleep paralysis, which still happens today, was often blamed on demons sitting on your chest. The imagination ran wild when the candle burned low. For travelers, nights were risky. Roads were unlit, inns were basic, and strangers could be dangerous. People carried lanterns or torches, but shadows stretched long and wild. You could not see who or what was ahead, so caution became instinct. Even experienced travelers slowed at night, trusting senses beyond sight, smell, hearing, and intuition. Animals were active too. Predators hunted in forests. Domestic animals reacted to every sound. The sounds of hooves, wings, or claws made people alert. This created tension, but also rhythm. Life moved at night, even if humans mostly stayed in their homes. Night hygiene was limited. Houses smelled. Smoke from the hearth mixed with human and animal scents. Open windows or cracks brought in cold air, smells from streets, and sometimes strangers. Sleep occurred amid smells and sounds that would feel overwhelming today, but were normal then. People adapted. Fear existed, but it was controlled. Candles, charms, herbs, and prayers offered comfort. Community offered safety. Stories and humor softened tension. Life continued despite darkness. Even for children, nights were lessons in survival. They learned which shadows to ignore, which sounds to heed, and which prayers to whisper. Darkness was part of education. Curiosity was tempered by caution. Imagination was encouraged but kept within the bounds of household rules and social norms. Nightlife in towns and villages was quieter than modern life, but it was real. People interacted, worked, prayed, and observed. Darkness shaped behavior. It taught patience, awareness, and respect. It gave rhythm to life, separating day from night, work from rest, and safety from danger. Modern life often hides the night. Streetlights, alarms, and screens give a false sense of safety. Medieval life embraced it. Night demanded attention, respect, and adaptation. People survived it because they knew it intimately, because it was a rhythm of life, not an obstacle. So when you imagine medieval nights, picture more than fear and darkness. Picture flickering candlelight, whispered prayers, quiet streets, animal sounds, tavern music, and the soft creak of a house settling. Life continued, carefully, attentively, and sometimes with a thrill that only darkness can bring. Darkness was dangerous, darkness was alive, and darkness was deeply human. Medieval people did not smell like roses, or at least most of them didn't. But that does not mean they were unhygienic in the way we think of it today. Life simply had a different relationship with cleanliness, smells, and what was considered normal. First, consider water. Fetching it was a chore. Wells were sometimes far from homes. Rivers were cold, and heating water required fuel and effort. A full-body bath was rare for most people. It happened occasionally, as a special event, not daily. Hands, face, and feet were washed more often because they were practical. Water was a resource, not a convenience. Clothing was part of hygiene. People wore linen undergarments, which were changed regularly. The idea was that the linen absorbed sweat and dirt, keeping the skin underneath relatively clean. Outer garments were reused and patched. Soap existed that was harsh. Frequent use irritated the skin, so it was applied sparingly. Perfumed herbs and oils helped mask odors and were also believed to protect from disease. Smell had meaning. Medieval homes had animals inside, especially in winter. Dogs, cats, chickens, and even pigs sometimes shared the space. These animals were useful, but they contributed to smells. People adapted. They did not think about masking odors like we do. They lived with them. A little stink was normal. You learned to ignore it or accept it as part of life. The smells of work were layered on top of all this. Smoke from fires, sweat from labor, and the occasional stench of waste filled streets and houses. Streets were messy, narrow, and crowded. Garbage, runoff, and manure mingled in ways we would find shocking. People tolerated it because survival mattered more than scent. Public bathhouses existed, but they were social and seasonal. Townsfolk would soak in warm water, sometimes together, sometimes in gender-segregated spaces. People talked, shared news, and occasionally argued about who got the best spot near the heat. Bathing could be enjoyable, but it was an event, not a routine. Fear of opening pores to illness sometimes kept people away. Yes, a bath could invite disease, according to medical thinking, so the risk had to be weighed carefully. To manage odors, herbs were everywhere. Lavender, rosemary, and sage were used to scent clothes, homes, and even bodies. People carried small pouches of herbs, especially when traveling. Masks infused with aromatic plants were worn by some to ward off disease, or at least the smell of it. They were fashion statements, practicality, and superstition all in one. Smell also signaled social information. Nobles could afford perfumed oils, clean garments, and separate living spaces. The scent of wealth was a quiet status symbol. Peasants smelled of labor, animals, and the environment. This was not necessarily shameful. It was practical and expected. People judged hygiene by norms, not absolute standards. Toileting added another layer. Privies existed in some homes, but most people used chamber pots or went outdoors. Waste disposal was rudimentary. Rivers sometimes carried it away, streets sometimes did not. Again, smells were accepted. People adapted noses and behavior accordingly. It was normal, even comforting, to know what smells to expect. Children learned early. They were not shielded from odors or the realities of hygiene. Lice were picked from hair, and body cleanliness was taught, but not obsessively. Practicality ruled. You could clean when it mattered, cover when necessary, and tolerate the rest. Childhood education included nose training, whether formally or not. Smells could also signal danger. Rotting food, spoiled water, and sick animals carried meaning. People developed remarkable awareness of what was safe and what was not. Scent became a survival tool. A sour smell might prevent poisoning. A foul odor could indicate disease. Living with smells sharpened senses. Even the wealthy smelled differently. They used perfumes and oils, but their homes were also full of animals, fires, and human activity. Hygiene was relative. Comfort mattered, but it did not eliminate the realities of living close to people, work, and animals. Religion shaped attitudes too. Some orders discouraged frequent bathing as indulgent. Cleanliness could be spiritual or moral rather than physical. Dirt was acceptable, even useful for humility and discipline. Smell, in this context, was part of life, not necessarily a problem. Medical theories influenced hygiene. Bad air, or miasma, was believed to cause disease. Strong scents, herbs, and incense were used to counter it. People carried smells with intention, not vanity. Safety and survival outweighed cosmetic concerns. So, medieval noses lived differently. They accepted odors that modern people avoid. They learned which smells mattered, which were normal, and which indicated danger. Smell was practical, social, spiritual, and even humorous. Imagine walking down a medieval street. You smell smoke, animals, herbs, sweat, bread, and waste all at once. Your nose adapts. You recognize patterns. You navigate the world not just with sight and touch, but with smell. It's overwhelming for a modern imagination, but normal for those who lived it. Living with smells was a lesson in tolerance, observation, and practicality. It shaped routines, interactions, and survival strategies. People did not live in sterile bubbles. They lived in rich, complex sensory environments where smell was a teacher, a warning, and sometimes even a friend. Medieval life was full of mystery. People did not have science to explain everything, and so superstition filled the gaps. From the way the wind blew to the way a cow acted, signs and omens shaped daily choices. Magic wasn't just entertainment, it was practical, emotional, and sometimes terrifying. People feared curses, evil eyes, and wandering spirits. A bad harvest could be blamed on witches. A sudden illness could be explained as divine punishment. Villagers carried charms, herbs, or little trinkets to protect themselves. Amulets, red threads, and small coins hidden in clothing were common. Sometimes the methods were symbolic, sometimes they were entirely practical, like carrying garlic to deter rats, which were believed to carry disease. Animals were involved in superstition too. Black cats were feared by some, revered by others. Owls were omens of death, crows signals of war or misfortune. People watched nature carefully, interpreting signs to guide decisions, when to plant crops, when to travel, or when to avoid certain paths. Even nobles were not free from superstition. Kings and queens consulted astrologers and seers. Calendars included lucky and unlucky days. Battles, marriages, and journeys were timed according to celestial advice. It might sound strange today, but at the time it made perfect sense. Astrology and magic were part of decision-making logic. Households were full of small rituals. Spilled salt could be countered with a toss over the shoulder. Walking under ladders was avoided. Mirrors breaking meant careful reflection and sometimes a chant or prayer. People acted as if every small action could influence fortune, because often it did, or at least they believed it did. Illness, in particular, was entwined with superstition. Fevers could be hot humors, curses, or punishment from God. Plagues were explained as miasmas, but also as divine wrath. People tried herbs, prayers, charms, and rituals all at once. Multiple approaches were better than one, because uncertainty demanded it. Waiting for recovery was easier when you had rituals to follow. Witchcraft was feared and policed. Some accusations were genuine. Someone practicing herbal medicine might be labeled a witch. Others were scapegoating, blaming neighbors for misfortune. Trials for witches could be cruel and unfair. Fear of magic shaped behavior, influenced justice, and created anxiety in communities. Children grew up immersed in superstition. Bedtime stories were not always gentle. Ghosts, fairies, and spirits were common lessons. Don't wander alone at night or a spirit will get you. The lines between entertainment, morality, and instruction were blurry. Children learned caution, respect, and imagination simultaneously. People also relied on everyday magic for comfort. A pinch of salt, a blessed coin, or a small charm could give courage. Superstitions were practical, even if they seem silly today. They reduced anxiety, offered control, and created rhythm in uncertain lives. Humans naturally seek patterns, and medieval life was full of unpredictability. Religious and magical beliefs overlapped. Saints were invoked for protection, relics were carried, pilgrimages were undertaken for cures or blessings, holy water and incense purified spaces. People mixed faith and superstition seamlessly. What was spiritual could also be protective. What was magical could also be moral. People's fear of the unknown was constant but manageable. Rituals, observations, and small precautions created predictability in a world that often had none. Even when death, disease, and disaster struck, people had tools to cope emotionally. They had stories, charms, and faith to help them endure. Markets were influenced by superstition too. Certain foods were thought to affect luck or health. Herbs sold not just for flavor, but for protection. Even everyday purchases included a mix of practicality and magic. Money might be carried in a certain way, coins placed carefully, not just for value, but for fortune. Nighttime magnified superstition. Dark streets, strange noises, and shadows encouraged belief in spirits and curses. Candles, charms, and careful movement offered comfort. People created rules: avoid certain paths, speak carefully, or leave offerings. Fear was real, but structured. Humor existed in superstition as well. People laughed at their own tricks, at neighbors' charms, and even at the ridiculous lengths one might go to avoid misfortune. But laughter did not invalidate the belief. It was part of the coping mechanism. Superstition was flexible, communal, and deeply human. Modern life often mocks superstition. Medieval life embraced it. It structured behavior, offered explanations, and helped people survive a harsh, unpredictable world. What we now call irrational was then practical, protective, and comforting. So when you imagine medieval superstition, think beyond the stereotypical witches and curses. Imagine careful observation, small rituals, daily habits tied to belief, and a community sharing stories, charms, and advice. Life was uncertain, yes, but humans had ways, magical, religious, and practical, to navigate it. Fear, ritual, and magic were woven into the ordinary. They guided daily decisions, comforted the worried, and created structure in chaos. Superstition was survival, culture, and imagination all at once. Darkness and danger existed, illness and death were constant, but people found ways to live, laugh, and act despite it all. Their fears, charms, and beliefs were part of what made medieval life vivid, real, and deeply human. Medieval people worked hard, prayed often, and worried constantly, but they also knew how to have fun. Entertainment existed everywhere, though it was very different from modern movies, video games, or concerts. It was noisy, participatory, and sometimes downright strange. Public events were a major source of amusement. Fairs were loud, colorful, and chaotic. Vendors shouted, animals wandered, music played, and people jostled through crowds. You could see jugglers, acrobats, and performers who risked life and limb for coins and applause. Food stalls offered treats that smelled good, but also added to the already overwhelming sensory mix of medieval life. Tournaments were highlights for many, especially in noble circles. Knights on horseback in full armor jousted while crowds cheered. These events were both sport and spectacle, combining danger, skill, and theater. Nobles and peasants alike attended, though from very different perspectives. For the wealthy, it was a display of power and chivalry. For peasants, it was excitement, drama, and a little bit of fantasy breaking the monotony of daily labor. Music was everywhere. Towns had minstrels, troubadours, and traveling performers. Songs told stories of love, war, and humor. Sometimes lyrics were bawdy, full of jokes and clever wordplay. Music was participatory. People clapped, sang along, or danced. It was communal and energetic, a contrast to the repetitive rhythm of work and prayer. Games existed too, both simple and complex. Dice games, board games like chess, and sports like wrestling or ball games entertained children and adults. Gambling sometimes accompanied games, adding risk, tension, and excitement. Competitions were informal or organized, but they brought communities together. People laughed, argued, and celebrated victories and defeats alike. Storytelling was crucial. Not everyone could read, so oral tradition carried news, legends, and humor. Tales of heroes, monsters, saints, and fools spread from town to town. Storytelling was entertainment, education, and morality all in one. Listeners learned about their culture, history, and values while enjoying drama and suspense. Humor was embedded, often dark or ironic, making people laugh even in hard times. The theater existed too, though in simple forms. Mystery plays, miracle plays, and morality plays depicted biblical stories or moral lessons. Performed in town squares or churchyards, these productions used costumes, props, and exaggerated gestures to engage audiences. Participation was common. Crowds sometimes shouted, mocked, or cheered. Theater was immersive, immediate, and communal. Hunting was entertainment for nobles, blending skill, danger, and social display. Tracking deer, boar, or birds required coordination, patience, and teamwork. Success brought prestige and food. Failure brought stories, jokes, and sometimes frustration. Hunting was a social event, often accompanied by feasts, music, and conversation. For peasants, watching the hunt from the sidelines was also a form of excitement. Even religion included entertainment. Festivals, processions, and feast days combined devotion with fun. Dancing, music, food, and pageantry created temporary escapes from labor. Saints' days were especially lively, offering both spiritual meaning and communal celebration. People could socialize, rest, and enjoy the unusual without leaving faith behind. Folk humor was everywhere. Practical jokes, teasing, and exaggerated tales made daily life more bearable. Children imitated adults, performing small pranks. Adults used humor to navigate stress. Laughter was survival, just as much as prayer, labor, or caution. Even solitary entertainment existed. People sang to themselves, played simple games, or observed nature. Quiet reflection, though less visible, offered mental relief. Not all fun required crowds. Sometimes observing a bird, listening to wind, or watching clouds was entertainment enough. Animals contributed too. Dogs, cats, and horses could amuse, frustrate, or impress. Pigs racing down streets? A spectacle. Horses performing tricks? Delightful. Animals were partners in entertainment, work, and storytelling. Alcohol often accompanied entertainment. Ale, mead, or wine lubricated social interaction, eased tension, and encouraged boldness. Taverns were lively, filled with laughter, gossip, and music. They were hubs for news, fun, and occasionally trouble. Humor and mischief thrived here, and the line between chaos and amusement was thin. Surprise and unpredictability were central. Life was risky, so entertainment reflected it. Juggler drops, night falls, or sudden weather changes made events thrilling. People celebrated unpredictability because in everyday life, monotony and danger already balanced each other. Entertainment offered controlled risk, joy, and release. So when you imagine medieval fun, do not picture quiet, polite games. Picture loud, messy, communal, and slightly chaotic events. Picture people laughing at mistakes, cheering for skill, singing together, and finding relief from work, fear, and routine. Life was harsh, yes, but humans always found ways to laugh, play, and celebrate. Entertainment was essential. It offered escape, community, and joy. It balanced the harsh realities of disease, labor, and fear. It was a reminder that medieval people weren't just survivors, they were human, curious, and alive. Fun was noisy, fun was dangerous, fun was messy, and medieval people loved it.